Good day. Yesterday, in my previous video, I floated the possibility that the Russians might decide to pull their troops out of Izyum and give up control of that particular town. I said that the Izyum operation, the occupation of Izyum, had been a disappointment, a military disappointment from a Russian point of view. It had not led to an advance on Slavyansk, as many people, including myself, by the way, expected in March. Russian troops had got bogged down in a forested area south of Izyum, known to the Russians as Sherwood Forest, because it was full of Ukrainian troops who the Russians were comparing presumably to Robin Hood's outlaws. Anyway, the Russians were never able to clear that particular forest. And the theory that was also promoted that occupying Izyum would somehow choke supplies from Ukraine to Slavyansk, to the whole Slavyansk and Donbass area. Well, that didn't prove to be true either. It turned out that the Ukrainians were still able to keep their troops in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and in Donbass supplied through other routes, and the capture of Izyum, in all respects, from that point of view, wasn't particularly effective. Similarly, and in addition, it's also the case that holding on to Izyum for the Russians has been a major problem. There are Ukrainian troops to the south of Izyum. There are Ukrainian troops to the west of Izyum. The whole place has been something of a salient, and the Russians have had to spend and devote an enormous amount of time over the last couple of months to parrying Ukrainian counterattacks, particularly to the west of Izyum, against their group of forces, the group of forces that they had concentrated there. So I floated the possibility yesterday that the Russians might decide, after the Ukrainian breakthrough near Balaklia, to actually pull their troops out of Izyum. I thought it was most unlikely to happen. I thought that the political optics of pulling out of a place like Izyum, which had been captured back in March, would be extremely difficult and embarrassing for the Russians. I thought that the Russian command would not do it. Well, this morning there are scattered reports, but reports which I have to say I think are convincing, that the Russians nonetheless have taken that decision. There was apparently a Security Council meeting in Moscow yesterday. I suppose it was in Moscow. Putin met with his military chiefs, and there seems to have been a decision made to pull all Russian troops in this area, the area where the Ukrainians have made this breakthrough north of Balaklia, to pull all Russian regular troops to the eastern bank of the Oskol River. This means that the western part of Kupiansk has been abandoned and Russian forces have withdrawn across the Oskol River to its eastern bank, and it means that Izyum, which is also located on the Oskol River, may also have been abandoned. I use the word may because there's still garbled information, and as I said in my previous videos, this is an incredibly fluid situation, and it may be that things are otherwise. Meanwhile, we're continuing to get news that Russian forces, Russian heavy forces, tanks, armoured vehicles, those sort of things, are converging on this area, but they are apparently and importantly not being sent to this area from the other battlefronts in and around Ukraine. It's not a case of the Russians taking troops from Kherson region or from Crimea, or indeed from the southern Donbass, where the fighting has been particularly intense recently. It's not the Russians doing those things or bringing in troops that they have positioned in other places around Ukraine in order to bolster the forces on the Oskol River. Instead, it seems that these troops are being brought in from the Central Military District, the area around Moscow, and of course it will take them several days to get to this area, and that will obviously means that in this situation, the Russians clearly don't have enough troops, enough heavy troops, to try to counter the Ukrainian forces that have launched this advance. And if we're talking about Ukrainian forces, we're talking about 5 brigades, a force of about 15,000 men. Not huge. This is not a major strike force. And I say 15,000 men, that seems to be the totality of the Ukrainian force that's been deployed. So that suggests that for the Russians to be pulling back across the Oskol River in the face of such a force of just 15,000 men, that suggests that the Russian forces in this area must be very few. And that's the next point I'm going to make, because it's clear that over the course of this offensive, there has been very little actual fighting. There have been some clashes. There were clashes yesterday near Kupiansk, which is a town north of Izyum. And it seems that the Ukrainians did try to storm Kupiansk, but that they were driven back. But overall, the fighting has been very light. The Ukrainians have been able to advance against practically no resistance. Now, this whole affair begs a large number of questions, and there's lots of people asking how could it possibly have come about? Why did the Russians do this? Was it possibly the case that they were already, for example, considering a retreat from Izyum? As I said, this place, this capture of Izyum, which in March had seemed so important, has been deeply disappointing to them. Or could there be some other reason? Was it the case that Putin, Shoigu and Gerasimov, respectively the Russian president, his defense minister and the chief of the general staff, took their eye off the ball? They went off to the Vostok maneuvers in the Far East. They didn't fully appreciate the danger of this operation in that the Ukraine was about to launch against Balaklia and ultimately to capture Kupiansk. Or was there some other factor at play that we simply don't know? Maybe was it the case that the Russians redeployed their forces to defend Kherson region, and the forces in Izyum were stripped bare in response to this? On the last point, I would say, by the way, emphatically no. I don't think that this is what happened at all. My understanding was that the forces that were deployed to Kherson region came from other parts of the Russian ground forces. They were not the forces that were deployed in Izyum previously. So what happened? Well, I'm going to say that I think that there probably is an element of truth, a strong element of truth, to the theory that the Russians, Putin, Shoigu and Gerasimov, took their eye off the ball. But I'm going to make a further speculation that I think most probably they thought that the defences in Izyum were much stronger, rather the defences in this area, in Balaklia and all the rest, were much stronger than they really were. And this is where I come back to my point, this point which I've made many times, that one of the oddities of this special military operation, something I only started to understand over the last couple of weeks, is that the militia the Donbass militia is preparing a disproportionate role in the fighting. Now, when I say this, it's important to stress that the point I made yesterday, that the Donbass militia does include some extremely tough units that are up to a professional level, that can hold out against Ukrainian forces, that are more than a match for Ukrainian forces in any particular battle. And I enumerated some of them, and by the way, I've had a number of explanations about why one of the units is called the Somali Unit, which I found extremely strange. It turns out that this was all because of the somewhat ragged appearance of the men who made up this unit when it was first formed in the 2014 fighting, and there was apparently jokes that they looked like Somali pirates, and the name was just adopted and taken up with an element of pride. So there are some very tough units in the Donbass militia, but other units are not so well organized. Some of them are made up of reservists, and these are people who, it is now clear, do not have the training and are not incorporated properly in regular military units, and therefore they're not really in a position to withstand an offensive by 5 Ukrainian brigades. Now, in saying all of this, I want to make it very clear that this is not so much a criticism of the militia. The militia is a militia. One should not expect or suppose that it can be a stronger force than it really is. It is a criticism of the Russian leadership in Moscow. They seem to have told themselves that units, militia units holding the line in places like Balaklia, Kupiansk, wherever, were competent to hold back an armoured advance by Ukrainian forces. And one could see all kinds of criticisms floating around, that no attempts were made to lay minefields in preparation for a Ukrainian attack in this area, that there were no artillery positions prepared, that there were no concrete bunkers and pillboxes. I have to say that if that was the expectation of the Russian command, then I think they were expecting altogether too much, and especially given that it seems that some of these militia units are actually severely undermanned and are not up to full strength. So if it was the case that the Russians expected that the militia would be able to hold back an advance of this kind, even if only for a few days, to allow Russian regular forces to redeploy, well, I think that was a completely misjudged calculation, and the Russians are now going to pay a price for it. Now, the question is, what do the Russians do next? They've now, it seems, working to establish this defense line across the along the Oskol River. So it's not a complete pullback from this entire area. And people, military commentators that I've seen, including some Russian ones who are incredibly critical of the Russian command and of Putin in particular, and have been, by the way, at all times, a number of them appear to be acknowledging that this is, in military terms, the correct decision. And I suspect that there will be an attempt now to hold this line on the Oskol River, and we will see when these Russian reinforcements do arrive that will be the decision that will be made. And I think that in military terms, that's logical, and I think that whilst the Oskol line is held, the rest of the military operation in Ukraine can continue as before, and I doubt that in military terms it will affect or influence the outcome very much. But I have to say that in psychological terms, in terms of morale, this has been a disastrous affair, an absolute debacle, and one should not try to minimize its significance. Ukraine has not succeeded in launching a successful offensive in any part of the Ukrainian conflict since 2014 up to now. Not only has Ukraine successfully launched an offensive, but it has recovered territory. It doesn't appear to have done much physical damage to the Russian military. Very few Russian soldiers apparently have been killed. Apparently, the Rosgvardia units that were evacuated from Balaklia had hardly any casualties at all. But the psychological effect of ceding ground, of ceding towns like Balaklia and Izyum to Ukraine is going to be dramatic. And it's going to be much more difficult to rationalize or explain away or justify than the pullback, the Russian pullback from areas around Kiev and Chernigov and Sumy back in March, when indeed there probably was some degree of political explanation, a political rationalization for the decision to pull back from those places. This time, pulling back in the face of what was an indisputable Ukrainian offensive is going to be seen across Ukraine, across the world, as a Russian defeat, because straightforwardly it is a Russian defeat. And that is going to have an impact in other areas which the Russians are taking under control. So people in Kherson region, in Zaporozhye, places where the Russians on the 4th of November intend to conduct referenda to see whether these territories might one day be incorporated into Russia. In Donbass itself, once Donbass is fully cleared of Ukrainian forces, those people in those areas are going to say to themselves, we can't rely on the Russians. They came supposedly to liberate us, to defend us. Well, we see what's happened. They pulled back from Kiev, they pulled back from Chernigov and Sumy, and now they've pulled back from Izyum and Balaklia, and they've abandoned the people there. So one day we may be abandoned as well, and in light of that, maybe the best thing for us to do is to distance ourselves from the Russian authorities and essentially avoid participation in these referendums. And the other thing it's going to do is it's going to have a military impact, because even though one can argue that Izyum was not particularly important, it had lost its utility from a Russian point of view, the fact is, again, that the Ukrainians have launched a successful offensive and have gained territory and have won a victory. And that is going to lift their morale at a time when everything else in the war has been going badly for them. Their economy is crumbling. Western support has been declining. It's now become increasingly clear that Western arms supplies are dwindling, and the Kherson offensive has been a debacle. But all of that is now going to be, I'm not going to say ignored, but it's going to be put aside to some extent by the lifting of hopes that will come from the fact that in this offensive in Kharkov, the Ukrainians have achieved a clear-cut victory. They've recaptured territory. They forced Russian troops to retreat. It may be, one can say, that maybe the Ukrainians have suffered losses. They've been apparently heavily knocked about by Russian artillery and Russian aircraft. You can also argue that they haven't engaged Russian troops to any significant degree, but nonetheless, the optics speak for themselves. And as Napoleon once said, in war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. So, having said all of that, this is not a decisive defeat for the Russians. It doesn't in itself, it seems to me, necessarily affect the outcome of the war. In fact, I don't think it does affect the outcome of the war. But it is now imperative for the Russians to get control of the situation in this area. And that means that if they are going to establish a line on the Oskol River, they must make absolutely sure that they hold it. And it also means that they must take steps to bring this operation in Donbass to an end. Now, I seem to be saying all of this as if I'm giving advice to the Russian command, but I am sure that the same advice is being given to the Russian command by all sorts of other people. And I'm sure that in Moscow as well, and between Moscow and Donetsk, there are going to be a huge amount of recriminations and red faces and demands for a rethink. It's become very clear to me over the last few weeks, I've discussed this in several videos, that what has happened in Donbass is that at some point in the fighting, and I'm not quite sure when and how this came about, but at some point in the fighting, control over the fighting in Donbass was ceded to the militia leaders and their political leaders in Lugansk and Donetsk. The facts here speak for themselves. When you read about Russian advances in Donbass, when you read about the capture of places like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, when you read about the advances of the forces opposite Donetsk city, the capture of places like Pesky, the capture of the growing trend towards encirclement of Avdiivka, which is these fortified areas opposite Donetsk city, in all of which places, by the way, the offensive continues and it continues to gain ground. It becomes immediately obvious that the bulk of the forces that have been committed to the fighting in Donbass, the forces that are actually conducting most of the infantry battles, are overwhelmingly drawn from the Donbass militia. There's the Wagner Group, which carries out its operations and which is present in Bakhmut city itself, and which has recently captured Kodyma, and which is definitely involved in the fighting around Bakhmut city. There's the Chechen forces, which are going to be redeployed to Donbass as well. But the bulk of the troops who are carrying out the operations in Donbass are militia. They're backed by Russian artillery, they're backed by Russian intelligence, by drones, by aircraft, by all of these things, but ultimately and primarily it is the Donbass militia that is doing most of the fighting. And that cedes control of the fighting in Donbass to the militia commanders. And they obviously operate within their own political remits and limitations. So whilst many people, not just myself, thought a few weeks ago that the focus of the Russian attack would be Bakhmut, which is this important town in Donetsk, instead, what we got after a visit to the area by the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu was an agreement instead to refocus attention on clearing these fortified Ukrainian positions opposite Donetsk city, something which makes complete political sense for the militia commanders, but which perhaps, and in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, by the way, has probably delayed the completion of this operation in Donbass itself. Now, what it seems to me the Russians have to do is that they need to be more proactive about what goes on in Donbass. And that may mean having to commit more of their own forces to the fighting. You get lots of people talking about the fact that the Russians are overextended in Ukraine. I don't think this is true at all. I think that this is a misunderstanding of the dynamics of the war. What has happened is that in Donbass itself, the fighting, the infantry fighting and the ground fighting, the ground war, is being carried out principally by the militia, and we have instead Russian military formations in southern Ukraine, in places like Zaporozhye and Kherson region, where there aren't or haven't been up to now local militias. There, Russian regular troops are stationed in significant numbers. That's one reason, by the way, why the Kherson offensive, Ukraine's Kherson offensive, has failed. But in Donbass itself, and as we've seen in Izyum and around Izyum, the Russian regular forces were few in number. They've apparently been pulled back to Russia, to their major bases, and it's the militia who have been conducting most of the fighting. Now, I am not saying that an operation which continues in this way cannot succeed. I suspect that given time, it will succeed. And I can also see the political attractions for Putin and the political leadership in Moscow to continue with this style of operations. They can continue to say that Russia is helping the two republics of the Donbass defend themselves, liberate their territory, which is what Putin said Russia would do right at the start of this war, which of course the Russians continue to refer to as a special military operation. But the problem with doing this is that it protracts this war. And whilst up to this point, I think this has been working to Russian advantage, it opens also the possibility for events like this Kharkov offensive to take place. Anyway, my own view is that if Russian regular forces are now indeed going to be deployed in large number to defend the Oskol River, line, as I presume is the case, then it also is necessary, will prove to be necessary, to redeploy some of them to defending, or rather to strengthening operations in Donbass in order to bring this operation there to an end. Now, I've said many times, I'm not a military expert. The kind of advice, what I'm suggesting here is my opinion. I'm entitled, always remember, to express my opinion, even on these sort of topics. But the point I'm making is that this isn't just my view any longer. It's the view of increasing numbers of people. And I think that the pressure on Putin to revise his tactics and his strategy over the next few hours and days in Russia itself is going to grow. Now, what he does, and the decision ultimately is his, I cannot predict. One of the things I've noticed about Putin is that when he decides on a strategy, he is someone who is extremely reluctant to change or adjust it. I can remember back during the fighting in Syria, back in 2016, the Russians, or the Syrian army with Russian air support, rapidly recaptured from the jihadi fighters, from ISIS to be precise, the important ancient site of the ancient city of Palmyra. And this was a major win. But then the Syrian army, the best forces of the Syrian army, were relocated north to liberate or to break the siege of what is actually Syria's biggest city, Aleppo, which was at that point under heavy pressure from jihadi forces. And Syrian troops were redeployed there, and Palmyra was very lightly defended by Syrian irregular forces that were not part of the regular Syrian military. And then what happened was that the siege of Aleppo became incredibly bogged down. And the reason it became bogged down is because Putin persisted in giving instruction after instruction to the Russian military, and by extension to the Syrian military, to negotiate humanitarian corridors and ceasefires, to allow civilians to leave, to allow food to enter, to do all those sort of things. Food to enter, I would add, jihadi-controlled areas. And this protracted the fighting in Aleppo by months, until eventually ISIS, well in the north, reorganized itself, saw that Palmyra was lightly defended, sent a force south and reoccupied Palmyra. And there was enormous numbers of red faces in the Russian command. There was a huge amount of anger within the Russian command. And for the first time, and the only time up to now, I remember Russian military officials, retired military officials, but I have no doubt at all that they were people who were speaking after consultations with the serving military. Retired military officials actually started to criticize Putin himself. They said that the reason Palmyra had been recaptured by ISIS was because he had protracted the siege of Aleppo to extraordinary lengths by this practice of constantly agreeing ceasefires in order to allow humanitarian corridors. And that meant that the Syrian army had been committed to fight in the wrong place, or rather had been not the wrong place perhaps, but had not been in a position to defend Palmyra from ISIS. And I remember that criticism very well, because it showed to me that the Russian military officers are prepared when they feel they must to utter criticism of their commander-in-chief. Now, as Alex Christoforou and I discussed in a program we did yesterday, which has appeared on our main channel, the Duran, the stakes for Putin and for Russia in Syria were nowhere near as high as they are in Ukraine. And we're talking about the feelings of the Russian public. They are vastly more engaged by the fighting in Ukraine than they are by the fighting in Syria. They take some interest in the Syrian operation because their troops are there, but they don't have that connection, that physical and historic and cultural and linguistic connection to Syria that they obviously do to the eastern regions, the Russian-speaking regions of eastern Ukraine. Now, in the case of Syria, despite all the criticism, Putin stuck with his strategy. He didn't modify it. He continued to agree humanitarian corridors and ceasefires in Aleppo, to the intense exasperation of his commanders, and eventually it paid off. The Syrian jihadi fighters who were besieging Aleppo were defeated. The Syrian jihadi fighters who had occupied part of Aleppo, eastern Aleppo, were evacuated to Idlib province by agreement with President Erdogan of Turkey, and eventually Palmyra was recaptured. But Putin had the political space to do that with Syria because, as I said, it ultimately didn't matter for Russians to the extent that fighting in a place like Kharkov, which most Russians, regard as a Russian city and its surrounding region, matters. So Putin doesn't have that degree of political space. Up to this point in time, trust and support for him over the course of this operation has been extremely high because Russians have understood or have accepted the reasons he gave for it, and they have felt that he has been conducting it in a proper way. But if there are more debacles like this, if further setbacks of this nature happen again, then that trust, that confidence in Putin is going to start to slip. Now, I hope, well, maybe hope is not the right word, but I wonder whether he understands that. And I wonder whether he is going to adjust his strategy in light of what has just happened. I'm sure that behind the scenes there's going to be a great deal of criticism of his approach to this conflict up to now, to his decision to rely so heavily on the militia to conduct the operation in Donbass, and that decision can only ultimately have come from him because it is a political decision rather than an operational one. I fully predict that over the next few days we're going to start to see retired officers from the Russian army coming out, and they're going to start to express criticisms of the way in which this thing is conducted. And I also predict that before very long, this is going to be picked up by other sections of Russian society. Now, as I said, he is a masterful man. He doesn't like to change his approach. He has also shown that he can be flexible in certain circumstances. We will see whether he is this time. Anyway, that's what I am going to that's all I'm going to say in this program today. I want to make it very clear that at the moment it's still a very fluid situation. I've just seen some reports which dispute the claim that Russian troops have in fact withdrawn from Izyum, but for the record, I think it's most likely that they have done. Anyway, we will see what happens. I will obviously continue to keep you updated, and in the meantime, all I can do is wish you a very good day. In the meantime, let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on other platforms, first and foremost locals, but also Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and the rest. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And you can also check out our shop, find the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, hoodies, sweatshirts, t-shirts, and all those things. And of course, if you've liked this video and wish to support this channel, please tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. As I said, this is a fluid situation. It could be that some of the information I've given in this program has been wrong or inaccurate. It may be that the Russians are indeed still in Izyum and intending to make a fight of it there. It may be that the reinforcements are arriving faster than I believe. But this is the situation as I see it today. I think it would be unwise, given the importance of events in this area of the battle, to go and discuss other issues. There are lots of things are happening around the world, and in the meantime, therefore, I will return again later tomorrow with a further program updating you about what seems to be happening. And in the meantime, all I can do is again wish you a very good day.